Welcome to this special service to celebrate women. We know that so many of you and us spent Saturday at state capitals and other places in your local community standing up for women's equality. And we thought it would be a great way to end that weekend by coming together and celebrating women's strength. If you were at a state capitol or a state event yesterday, I'd love it if you would share the name of that place where you type, just so that we would see all of the places that were represented yesterday. I couldn't be who I am and where I am today without literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of women who came before me, who went before me blazing trails that allowed me to be ordained a minister, as an open lesbian, and as a die-hard feminist. I want to thank all of you, and you can't begin to know who you are. And I want to call out a few names in particular. As I do, I suspect every one of you will think of names yourself that you want to share. And if you can stand to, I invite you to hold on to those names. And after I'm done talking for a few minutes, we're going to have a song by Anne Reed called Heroes, celebrating women who are our heroes, and also naming all of our own. And that will be a chance to really pour those names out. You know, Paul Tillich, a great theologian of the 20th century, defined God as the ground of our being. There's no doubt that the person who is in fact the ground of my being is my mother, Marty Wilson. She died about 10 years ago, and I miss her every day. My mom was a teacher and an activist for justice and a full believer in women's equality, as was my father, I'm happy to say. But my mother's the one who said to me one day when I was complaining that we lived in this horrible place, Akron, Ohio, and went to the most boring church on the planet, the Unitarian Universalist Church in Akron, Ohio. It was my mother who said to me, "Do you know, some really interesting things have happened in our church. Look up what happened in 1851 at the Universalist Church of Akron." I looked and looked, and finally I went to the library at the University of Akron in Akron, Ohio, which had formerly been the Universalist Bookdale College. And there were 30 volumes that I got to handle documenting the Women's Rights Convention that took place in Akron, Ohio in 1851. And in my very own church, the Universalist Church, Sojourner Truth gave her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" I was so excited about that speech, and I went to my junior high school to share it in speech class. And do you know what somebody said to me after I shared it? And this was in 1969. The most popular boy in the class raised his hand and said, 1969, "Women's equality, isn't that kind of old news? Isn't that kind of passé, like 40 years ago, 50 years ago?" I say that because still today, every time you bring up women's rights, it doesn't matter if it's 1929, 1969, or 2012, people say, "Oh, Jan, we already did that." Sojourner Truth gave a speech at that convention that rallied people, that people still remember, and I got to look at the original transcript, "Ain't I a Woman?" The second woman that I want to name as a woman of spirit who has influenced me is Mary Daly. Mary Daly's book, Beyond God the Father, changed me, I have to say, more profoundly than any book I've ever read in my life. Before I read that book, I always felt like there was this conventional way of being, and I was kind of out here somewhere. I didn't even know how to connect to a lot of what was conventional. Mary Daly was further out than I was, and all of a sudden I could exist between two things for the first time in my life. Mary Daly, who's envisioning a radical way of creating women's space, coming together as women's spirit, really, whether you agree or disagree with her, she's pretty radical. She carved out ground that so many of us could not be who we are if we didn't stand on it. And the third that I'll name, and there are so many that we could name and will name, the third that I will name is Carter Hayward. Carter was one of the first Episcopal priests to be ordained, and that was amazing when those women took ordination into their own hands, said to the church, we don't care if you won't ordain us, we're ordaining ourselves, and the rest is history. And then Carter came out as a lesbian. Not only came out, but wrote theology about coming out as an act of faith, about coming out as a spiritual path. But the truth is, in the 70s and 80s, women's spirituality changed all the seminaries. It changed everything about theology. And that's why it makes me so angry now when it feels like we're going backwards, when it feels like a bunch of men can claim that they speak for God and the mainstream media accepts that without challenging it. And so we say, oh no, hold on, you've only got part of the story. Not only part of the story for women, but only part of the story for men, because so many men's lives have changed so radically since I was a kid. And so now I invite you, as this song plays, to share the names and maybe a few words about women who changed your life. Marty Wilson, Sojourner Truth, Mary Daly, Carter Hayward. Those are just 4 of the hundreds of names I could name. What are a few of yours?